The podcast that actually started in 2009. And I just did it because podcasts were new at the time. I was like, this is
Yeah.
kind of, I was in that phase in my career where you're just kind of throwing spaghetti at the wall and exploring, and seeing what you liked and seeing what worked. So I did the podcast. For me, it was basically an excuse to talk to authors of books that I read.
Yeah.
Always been a voracious reader. The podcast was just an excuse to talk to people who wrote books that I enjoyed. Um, and I started in 2009. It didn't really go anywhere. I didn't get much feedback on it. It took a lot of time, and there was no way to monetize podcasts at the time, really. And so I did it for a year, and then I decided, you know what? No one really cares about this. Like, downloads are sort of anemic. I don't get any emails about like, hey, I enjoy the podcast. Um, Most of our revenue came from, writing text articles from web advertising. It's like, I'm going to put the podcast on hold. So we put the podcast on hold. And then in around 2012, I started getting emails from people like, hey, what happened to your podcast?
Right.
I'm like, why am I getting all these emails? And I think what happened was that was around the time when podcasting started to pick up a little bit of mainstream attention. I
Yeah.
think really was the thing that did it was there was that podcast Serial from NPR. I think it was like
Right.
a murder true crime
The true
podcast.
crime podcasts really kind of like were
Yeah, that was the thing.
viral for them. Yeah.
And so I was like, oh, okay, yeah, I'll bring back the podcast. And what was happening, there was an ecosystem starting to develop in the podcast business where there was um, better technology. There was actually companies out there that are helping podcasts monetize. And so I started the podcast again, and I got connected with the company that started managing our advertising for our podcast. And podcast became a big thing. So the podcast for a long time was like the side project. It wasn't
Yeah.
the main driver of revenue or attention for what we're doing here. I would say around 2015, 2017, the podcast became really like the main event, and the website, the text articles was kind of the side project. So.
Interesting how that kind of pivoted like that. Uh, Not too long after that, we kind of entered the COVID era. Did that impact your plan?
No, I mean, it was actually COVID was really great for our business.
Yeah.
Because a lot of our articles, we got so much search traffic during that time because a lot of our articles were just like how to do stuff, like how to like we even have a lot of articles like on hobbies and things like that. So we had a lot of people who were looking for articles on how to bake bread. Because a lot of people were baking bread during COVID.
That was
Um,
good for me when that happened. Yeah.
yeah, for sure. I mean, so our web traffic went up. That was great. Yeah, the podcast, it has affected the podcast. Uh, 2020, everyone was bored, everyone was at home, so everyone started a podcast. So competition definitely got
Yeah.
stiffer
It's a
from
very crowded
2020.
field these days,
It's
but
super crowded. Yeah, I
yeah.
mean, it was, back then when I was first starting out, I was a top 50, top 25 Apple podcast.
Yeah.
um like the entire ecosystem. That's not the case anymore because there's too many podcasts to compete with.
But every podcast has to find its niche, and you have kind of had already established your niche.
Yeah, so I
And
had the first mover advantage. I feel like I have my audience. Like the guys have been, not even guys, you have a lot of women that listen to the podcast and read the
well,
website.
that's a question I really wanted to get to because the art of manliness, it's your audience is not just men, right?
No, yeah, so I'd say like 85% are male. But so we have about 15% who are women. And yeah, the women like what we do. The women, they I don't know how would they say describe it? They like it because it gives them an insight about the men in their life. They want to help the
Yeah.
men in their lives, their
Yeah.
moms, their wives, their sisters, their daughters. But also, I mean, a lot of the content we write, I mean, it is geared towards men, but it's applicable to anybody,
Because
really.
it's really universal. The deeper purpose
Yeah.
of this is much more universal than
Oh,
just,
for sure.
yeah.
And I think it's just yeah, I mean, we're our audience, we're just trying to target men. We're trying to present this information in a way that I think men would find appealing. But of course women can find it appealing as well. I mean, it's like I give the example like I'll pick up I read women's magazines. Like I'll pick up when I'm at the dentist and there's a copy of Family Circle, I'm gonna pick it up and I'm gonna
Right.
thumb through and like, oh, here's a great tip on how to organize my Tupperware. This is actually really handy.